Howdy. Welcome to Ausgrave Royalty. I am Justin. Today we're continuing our series with more in Gillette's King, Warrior, Magician, Lover material. We're doing a series on this channel, so check out the previous videos if you haven't already to get the full context of what we're talking about here, as well as the wider context that we're exploring on the channel with archetypal psychology. This is the second season in that vein for archetypal psychology. In the first season, we covered the book Archetypes by Dr. Anthony Stevens. So check that out as well. That first season set up the theoretical foundation for this second season. First, the theoretical. What we're talking about here, specifically the warrior, previously we talked about the king, these are applications of archetypal psychology. And they may make, they will certainly make less sense, but maybe they might make no sense if you don't know anything about this stuff. So maybe consider checking those previous videos out, or you can hop in and tag along ad hoc. So this is the second mature masculine archetype that Moore and Gillette are covering. The first being the king, which we spoke about previously. Now we're talking about the warrior. The king was TLDR. It was the center of things, the visionary, the procreator, the transforming vessel, the boundary setter, the structurer, right? And any impulses and actions that align with those sorts of activities, they come from the king archetype. And as the real ones know on this channel, the real fans, archetypes are tied to humanity's survival. They have been throughout human history. It's part of our biology. So we talked about the king energy. Anytime we're structuring or procreating or creating a vision or thinking about a vision, envisioning a vision, this is coming from the king. All right. Just a quick note here. This isn't like Subaru, Seattle, coffee, water. Like, these aren't arbitrary names. The reason that why they're called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover is because Moore and Gillette are utilizing the study of anthropology, of religious rituals, of ancient customs, all sorts of things, and aggregating it with the Jungian psychology stuff. So that's why when we talk about a king or a warrior, these theories and these qualities that these images conjure are not arbitrary. They're specific related images for a reason. And that reason is that of their preponderance in human history throughout cultures that are unrelated. Right. On this channel, or for this season, we're not emphasizing that side of things. We're emphasizing the psychological side of things, but it is important to articulate that side, the relevance of that side. So with all that in mind, let's talk about the warrior. So, no other masculine archetype is as demonized in our modern world as the warrior. Many mistake it as toxic masculinity or just pure unleashed aggression. As we'll see, the warrior is the healthy manifestation of the warrior is far from that. And we'll talk, like we talked about the king's shadow possessions, the warrior has its own shadow possessions as well, and we'll get to that. Moore says that we can't just willfully banish archetypes as we like. They're here to stay because they serve our survival. As And we'd better, he says, we better make them conscious lest they possess us. And that's when we'll talk about the shadow possession. So why do we have this warrior impulse? Maybe there's a reason it helps in our survival? Let me know in the comments what y'all think. Could aggression help us survive? They say, the warrior allows us to access the energy we need to affect change in our internal and external world. So, more in Gillette say, without a mature accessing of aggressive potential, healthy differentiation and effective action is impossible. Let me read that again. So, without a mature accessing of aggressive potential, healthy differentiation and effective action is impossible. If we are accessing the warrior appropriately, we will be energetic, decisive, courageous, enduring, persevering, and loyal to some greater good beyond our personal gain. We will care for ourselves and others. We will fight good fights in order to make the world a better and more fulfilling place for everyone and everything. Our war making will be for the creation of the new, the just, and the free. The warrior is the energy source. The so-called aggression it's infamous for is necessary for getting through that pile of paperwork, finishing that project, or bringing home the kill. It's been a vital characteristic of human survival and evolution. To be clear, it's not an energy source just for affecting change in the physical realm. It's also the energy needed to do self-work, work out equations, maintain relationships. And like we said in the last episode, the king may be responsible for creating relationships, but it's the warrior that allows those relationships to thrive. So we said in the last episode that the king defines the realm. The king creates the boundaries, right? But when you're defending your boundaries, when you're standing up for yourself, that is not the archetype of the king. That is your inner warrior, right? The king defines and the warrior maintains and enforces. We talked about the king creating the laws of the land. The warrior maintains the laws of the land. The warrior is not thinking about what kind of laws can we create. The warrior is thinking, what are the laws that need enforcing, right? The warrior is about the mission, as Moore likes to say. What's the mission? Wherever there is a mission, you'll find the warrior. Moore says, the warrior is an energy resource, one that permits us to be assertive about our lives, goals, needs, and causes. He gets us moving again after a period of stagnation. He supports us when we act from our real feelings and needs instead of from other people's expectations. Instead of our compulsively saying yes when we mean no, he directs us to responses that are in our strategic self-interest. If we say yes under the warrior's aegis, we mean it. If we're in tune with our own warrior and we agree to do something, we're going to do it. So there's some other characteristics about the warrior. They help to set goals and achieve them. King is more setting the goals, you could say, but you could also say that you might say that the king has kind of a general vision, but the energy to chop away at that vision and make it into smaller steps. That there's a magician involved there, which we'll get to, about how the steps should be sliced. But the warrior, he latches on, he can define objectives. He can latch on and commit to objectives and achieve them. Um, the distinctive characteristic of the warrior is self-discipline. It's the capacity to determine friend versus foe. Very important boundary to have. You might think it's obvious, but with the rise of narcissism lately in our society, it's not always easy. The capacity to remain faithful, very modern problem as well, so I hear, and serves as an anesthetic to pain and suffering for the sake of achieving a goal. Like Nietzsche said, a man can endure any how if only he has a why. Far from being a blunt instrument, the archetype of the warrior has plenty of nuance. And this is like the vision that I like to think of when I think of the warrior, that the warrior is the king's sword. The warrior serves the king's vision. It's like the king's right hand. The king says jump, and the warrior says how high. It is of utmost importance that the warrior be serving a king, what Moore calls a transcendent other. Without this characteristic of servitude, Moore warns that this energy becomes a self-serving mercenary. So to further articulate that issue, I love this passage from Moore and Gillette's book. So there is a story about a samurai attached to the household of a great lord. His lord had been murdered by a man from a rival house, and the samurai was sworn to avenge his lord's death. After tracking the assassin for some time, after great personal sacrifice and hardship, and after braving many dangers, the samurai found the murderer. He drew his sword to kill the man. But in that instant, the assassin spit in his face. The samurai stepped back, sheathed his sword, and turned and walked away. Why? He walked away because he was angry that he'd been spat on. He would have killed the assassin in that moment out of his own personal anger, not out of his commitment to the ideal his lord represented. His execution of the man would have been out of his ego and his own feelings, not out of the warrior within. So in order to be true to his warrior calling, he had to walk away and let the murderer live. The warrior's loyalty, then, and his sense of duty are something to something beyond and other than himself and his own concerns. Can you imagine that kind of being in tune with your warrior energy? Healthy warrior expression, so devoted to the ideals of your Lord. Granted, that is outsourcing your own inner king to your Lord, but the principle remains the same. The healthier way would be to have your own vision and fight like that, but for your own particular inner king. That you can be your own king. You can serve your own inner king. When the warrior and the king are together, they're very formidable. They work together very well. The king paints the target, the warrior executes. It's like having a great project manager and a great expert, a great engineer. The project manager just gives all the steps to the engineer, and the engineer's like, are those steps I can follow? I don't have to think about a project to create. You're doing that for me, so I don't have to do it? Man, that's awesome. All this creative stuff, I don't know what to do. Just give me something to do, you know? It's like the perfect relationship. So I say, I have my notes here, note the choice of words. It was to his Lord's ideals, not to the individual Lord to whom the samurai was devoted. That's what the transcendental other is, another term for the king from this perspective. It's the ideal that fuels the warrior's mission, There is no warrior without service to an ideal of some kind. And the ideal's particular nature depends on the activation of the king archetype within the individual man. Another nuance is that anthropologically, Moore cites the warrior archetype as potentially being the origin of religion. He says, in Totem and Taboo, Freud notes that in tribal societies, warriors returning from battle had to be separated from their communities in order to be ritually purified, a process that allowed them to come down from the high of archetypal possession. Only once normal ego structures had been restored were the men allowed to rejoin the community. This reminds me of that scene in The Northman, the recent movie, when the berserkers are engaged in that ritual dance, when they're transforming into ravenous beasts in the upcoming battle. This is the power that the warrior can grant. Well, you think all that's arbitrary nonsense, primitive nonsense? It serves an important psychological function. And we talked in the previous season about psychic inertia and how in order to affect change, you have to be heated sufficiently, alchemically speaking. These ritual dances help get you in the mode. It's like Wolf of Wall Street, like the Matthew McConaughey chant. You know, it's bringing your lucky fishing rod, you know? Yeah, whatever. Say what you want, but they are sparking that energy of the warrior to get you into that mode. And I want to talk more about that. There's a YouTuber named Richard Grannon who has a history of training people in urban self-defense, I think. He talks a lot about, I found him through his talks on narcissism, but he once spoke of something he called supra states, S-U-P-R-A, supra states. And I'll try and find the video below and link it below. But these are states in which participants are trained to snap into and out of aggression to fend off attackers. Like, he needed to train mild-mannered businessmen and women to be able to turn this on at a moment's notice. So, like, if you're being ambushed, like, you just, it helps to get into a mode of destroy because it means whether you survive or not, right? And I found this very interesting and sounds kind of like tapping into the warrior, getting into a state where, you know, you're in that mode to kill and to defend yourself and survive. And this can get out of hand, though. And now we'll talk about the shadow possessions of the warrior. And this is what Moore and Gillette call the sadist and the masochist, and or sadomasochism in general. These are perversions of the warrior archetype. And yes, that includes the sexual element as well, although that won't be the focus of this video. So, one principle to remember is that if you're not in a healthy accessing of the warrior archetype, you are to some degree being possessed by the unhealthy archetype. It's very binary like that. But just like nobody can ever be in 100% perfect health, doesn't mean it's not something to aim for. These shadow possessions, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, reside in the shadow. And we've talked about the shadow before on the channel. I won't go into all of its elements here at this moment. But Jung said that what we fail to make conscious, we will act out unconsciously in the world, and we'll call it fate. So individuation, aka mental health, aka wholeness, comes from embracing these unconscious, aka potentially destructive and unhealthy aspects of ourselves that we're not aware of, that we're blind to. And that's what shadow work is, making the unconscious conscious. So just a little tangent about that. So Moore says about the, let's see, starting with, so talking about the shadow possession of a warrior, Moore says, these are the ministers, social workers, and therapists, the doctors and lawyers who work literally day and night trying to plug the physical and psychological holes in other people, sacrificing their own lives for the sake of saving others. In the process, they really do a lot of harm, both to themselves and to others who can't measure up to their impossible standards. They can't, of course, measure up to their own standards, so they mercilessly abuse themselves. If you have to admit to yourself that you don't really take care of yourself, if you have to admit to yourself that you don't really take care of yourself, that you don't take care of your mental and physical well-being, then very probably the shadow warrior has got you. Basically the workaholic, he says, the man who becomes, or woman, obsessed with succeeding, the person obsessed with succeeding has already failed. Worth thinking about. So that's kind of the sadistic side. So the masochistic side, if we are under the power of the masochist, Moore says, we will take far too much abuse for far too long and then explode in a sadistic outburst of verbal and even physical violence. Again, the warrior is about maintaining boundaries of all kinds, physical and in relationships. The masochist is the pushover that has trouble defending himself psychologically. He allows others and himself to push him around to exceed the limits of what he can tolerate and still keep his self-respect, not to mention his psychological and physical health. It may be we don't know when to quit an impossible relationship, a circle of friends, or a frustrating job. Moore continues, the man whose ego is more closely identified with the masochist brings sadists into his life. He has a wound exactly the size and shape of the sadist's sword. Love that line. He projects his repressed sadist onto those people in the outer world who are, in fact, sufficiently sadistic to attract and hold his projections. Similarly, the man with a sadistic identified ego ensures that there are masochists available for him to torture. Wow. Again, what we fail to make conscious, we will act out unconsciously, and then we'll call it fate. Any of this going on in your life? And there's a fine line, though. I remember I was like opening up to a girl I was seeing, and my employer was like, I was just venting that my employer was asking me repeatedly to like adjust the volume on this speaker. And I was like, oh, that was annoying. And she was like, let him have it, stop being a pushover. Don't be a pansy. And I mean, there are a lot of wrong things about that situation. But I thought about that, like, when she said that, a lot of things went through my mind, of course. But of course, the number one thing was like, am I really like that? And I told her, well, I don't think that I am actually, because you can't fly off the handle at every little thing. That's equally psychologically unhealthy. Can you imagine? Like, it's the narcissist, right? It's the person who, again, like, you can't just fly. If you fly off the handle at every single little slight, you'll alienate everyone around you. And not to mention, I have to see this person, my boss, my employer, tomorrow, at the next work day. Am I going to create a confrontation? Am I going to start a war for every little slight? Yeah, I thought I was venting with something kind of within my boundaries. Like if he had been yelling at me or something like a little bit more obvious, that would be one thing. But he didn't realize he was maybe being a little nitpicky, but I have a thick skin, but the warning is noted. Like sometimes your skin maybe can be too thick. Like you can be thick-headed and not realize you're being taken advantage of. So there's a very fine line, So Moore and Gillette talk about, articulate the aspects of a warrior with the anthropological side. Just as a quick note here, that's not our emphasis, but I do want to bring up this one thing. They cite the process of a warrior that a warrior can go through in the white, the red, and the black knights of legend. So, little thing about this. The white knight uses his sword, and these are symbolic, by the way, highly symbolic. The white knight uses his sword in innocence, unaware of the harm he causes. The red knight lifts his sword in outrage, in self-righteousness, uncaring about the damage he or she leaves in the trail behind them. But the black knight wields his sword reluctantly, and only when he has reached the sober realization that it is necessary. The man who has integrated the white and the red knights and accepted the black knighthood has confronted his own warrior shadow and moved towards taking a moral and spiritual responsibility for his own aggression. Once we take responsibility for our own destructive potentials, we have our first real chance at masculine maturity. With this maturity, we can take up our own swords and use them in generative ways. We will be able to assert our realistic greatness and defend and promote our interests and needs. As we gather strength to live true lives, we will find ourselves pledging fealty to something that is greater than ourselves. We will wear our swords with confidence and integrity and for everyone to see. The warrior's very extroverted about taking action. And once again, it comes down to making the unconscious conscious, becoming aware of how the warrior is being utilized in your own life and correcting accordingly. Moore reminds us that the buck stops with each of us. If we want to actually generate goodness and prosperity in our inner and outer lives, we have to take this mission of properly accessing our warrior as our personal responsibility. The way the world is, the divisions of race, gender, class, and the presence of nuclear weapons, etc., the stakes have never been higher. The more, again, last thought I want to remind y'all with is the more these are outsourced, like maybe you have a friend with a strong warrior that you kind of just associate with that does all the fighting for you, right? You need to fight your own battles. It's not healthy to outsource archetypal energies. It's not healthy to outsource the king, which we talked about in the last video in this series. It's not healthy to outsource the warrior. Come up with a vision for your own life and execute. Yeah, easier said than done, right? Well, that brings us to the end of this video. Hope you all got something out of it. Hope you all will check out the other videos in this series. Yeah, I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.